Do you ever wish that you could have a peek at another creative's branding process? I feel like this all the time because even though I've been working with this for like 8 years now, I feel like there's always some tips and tricks that you can pick up. So because you guys have really loved all of my recent branding videos, I decided to create a full case study for you where we're going to be designing the whole brand from scratch, and we're going to do the logo, the brand research, we're going to create packaging and illustrations, and I'm super excited to share it with you. If you're super interested in a specific part of the process, like sketching logos or picking colors, I have put all of the timestamps down in the description of this video, so you can jump straight there if you like. Without further ado, we're just going to jump straight in and have fun creating a new brand from scratch. So the brand we're going to be working on today is called Nifty, and they're a vegan food brand, so they focused on creating vegan meats. Now, in my typical branding process, I always have 5 stages, which are discovery, when I try to find information from my clients, so understanding what they already know about their customers and their products. Then we have research and mood boards, which is when I try to look outside of my client and verify any information that they've told me, but also look for other trends that they might have missed. We then have concepting, where we're creating multiple alternatives in my case, but of course you could also create one. We then have iterations, and finally handoff of the brand and creating a brand guide. So in the video today, I'm going to focus on the research and mood board and on concepting. And if you're super curious about things like discovery or even brand handoffs, I have a lot of videos on that, so I'm going to link some of the best ones for you down in the description. Let's start by having a look at the Nifty brand, so that we have a bit of background information before we start actually designing. So as I mentioned, they're a vegan meats brand. Their audience currently that they're focusing on is only vegans, and they're mostly focused on the UK market. Now, I said only vegans, but they don't really have much more specificity than that, so they're not particularly niched down, and they don't have a very defined target audience. They tend to use marketing in terms of going to food conventions, which is a great way for them to interact with customers and get information about what they care about. One of the main things that they found was that their customers weren't out actually only vegans. Lots of people who are flexitarian and wanting to reduce the amount of meat that they eat, they actually really want something that can go back into their normal kind of routines. So they actually really like things like nuggets or sausages or mince or things like that they can easily cook their old recipes with, but in a vegan way. The problem that Nifty is having, which is why they're approaching us for the rebrand, is that they're feeling like their branding is not standing out on the shelf. In this example, the branding is very generic. It's very focused on health and green and lots of leaves and plants and things like that. But we're actually not seeing a lot of specificity to their product or something that makes them unique. They also don't really have anything that is connecting with a specific audience. So they just have kind of the vegan food market as an audience, but they need help defining who their customer is and really appealing to them. Now that we know a little bit more about the company, I want to dig into the research part. And this is where I really want to make sure I focus on more than just the visual. We're going to create a mood board, but the first thing I want to do is to understand more about the audience and help my client define their audience better. So the first thing I want to do is just search for things like vegan demographics UK. You could do this for flexitarian, you can go really deep. And of course, you're looking for sources that feel reliable. So this one, Statista, is one of my favorite ones because it compiles a lot of information and you can often access most of the versions for free. So this is super interesting. So who is actually vegan and vegetarian in the United Kingdom? So in this case, we can see the eating no meat is much more widespread among younger people. And this is super interesting. So this is a statistic we can pull out. If we click on this, we'll get a graph where we can see that the majority of people who are focusing on eating less meat are actually Generation Z, so the people who are younger right now. We can also see, of course, more in these two generations, Millennials and Gen X, but not so much in the older generations. So this can help us define that in this case, our audience is probably under 35. Something else that we can do is to start going to places like Dieline, which is a great packaging website because this is going to be a food brand. So vegan food trends, for example. So here we can see some trends that are around plant-based food. And so here we can start to have a look at what is actually happening. So one thing that's really great about this article is it actually highlights some of the different trends that we can see here. So we can see, for example, monochromatic packaging. So that sounds super interesting. So we can have a look at that and start to see some examples, right, where we have colorful but still seeing a monochromatic pattern. That's super interesting. So this kind of lighter color on darker and the other way around. Yeah, okay, super interesting. That's something we can keep in mind. Another trend is to look at flexible logos. That sounds super interesting. Let's have a look. So here we can see, right, so I think when they say flexible logos, it's what I would call a responsive logo, which is basically that it responds to the size that it's at. So you might have seen something like Disney's logo that has the D and then has different versions with or without the castle, for example. So this is something that's also interesting to keep in mind. Now, something that I want to highlight here is from this visual research and kind of the trend research, we can see that there are usually 3 categories of types of vegan brands when it comes to meat. The first one is what we can see very well demonstrated by the Impossible Burger, which is when we're really trying to emulate meat. So this is when the product looks like meat, the branding feels very kind of traditional meat packaging, but with a very vibrant spin to it, I would say, and that usually appeals to a younger audience. The second one is a good example looking at the Beyond Meat one. So here we can see that we're trying to go for a very natural, kind of like farm inspired design, and this is where we really have this kind of handcrafted textures. There's like a little bit of grain in the typography, things like that. That's the second one. And then the third one is right underneath, which is the Simple Truth one, for example, which is really focusing on the natural aspects. So not just the kind of the farm aspects, but the very natural aspects. So a lot of the distinction between the Beyond Meat one and the Simple Truth one to me is that the Simple Truth one is really focusing on the ingredients being very sort of leaves and green colors and really playing on this kind of like a very healthy, almost maybe I can dare to say diet style of things. While actually this one, the Beyond Meat example, is actually going a little bit more into a kind of traditional butcher shop style. Now that we have a little bit more background on the research, we're going to jump into creating the mood board. And the first step I like to do is just to do a kind of brain dump of things that I find on photography sites like Unsplash and Avata Market, and other sites like the Dieline, blogs, Pinterest, and Behance, and things like that. So basically trying to get all of that into Media Note where I can start to curate and see a bit more of an overview. I like to have everything in one place so that I can make sure that the colors work well together before I start creating the mood board. Because I feel like one of the main things that often goes wrong when you're trying to create a very curated mood board is having lots of different type styles or lots of different colors. So this is an example that I've put above here of this type of focused mood board that I've created before. So as I mentioned, color is very important. So sometimes you might have to change the color of a design that you find if it's basically perfect, but you just need to tweak the color. One thing that I really thought about when I picked out these photos is how the kind of red onion in the photography that we see on the left with the kind of bow bounds makes for a really kind of pop of color that we want in the brand without it feeling like there's too much unnatural color, because when you're designing for food you always have to keep appetizing looking things in mind. So some colors just doesn't look good with food, and especially when you're working with meat, or in this case vegan meats, it's something that is going to still look appetizing, cooked or uncooked, with the packaging. Whenever I create a mood board, I try to place things out the way that it feels balanced, but as I create it, I'm going to tweak it, I'm going to add things, and I especially work on the colors back and forth as I'm creating more examples and seeing how it all fits together. In this example, I'm trying to bring in a bit more playfulness, not only with the color scheme, but I'm also trying to bring it in with type that you can edit. This is something that I only learned recently, which is there's a tool in Illustrator where you can actually go and edit the type which keeps the type actually live as type. You don't have to expand it to edit it, but you can still turn letters and rotate them, or you can scale them or change them. Another tip that I think is really great if you're creating a mood board and you need a little bit more images or examples that fit your exact color palette is you can go to Behance and you can search using their color picker. So here you can choose from one of the colors that they offer, which is a wide range, and then you can look for images using your search terms. I think it's always a really good idea to include examples that are really relevant to your clients, just like you would when you're creating the mock-ups at the end. So things like packaging, if it's a food brand or a product brand, and things like social media posts, if it's going to be a very digital brand. So things like that are great to include already at the mood boarding stage. So this is what we ended up with. It's a very happy, colorful, and younger looking brand that is very type playful, if I can put it that way. We also have these kind of light purpley tones, this more deep color in the kind of Heck brand that we can see with the sausages, and we have a bit more of a playful tone to meat. So something that isn't as focused on barbecue, but something between indulgent food and healthy food. So whenever I start drawing, I like to just be super open and explore any concept just to get out of my mind. I like to work in Procreate to sketch because I have different brushes that can emulate things and I can kind of keep everything in one place. But you can also draw on paper, it has the complete same effect. What I like to do is just to test out ideas where I feel like there's a lot of space in the name. So sometimes you have words where the letters create a lot of empty space and it can look a little bit awkward. So I like to explore different ways to fill up that space in a way that looks very intentional. I also like to see, as you can see here, exploring a little bit of either using an angle or using like a curve, just to kind of see different interesting layouts. What I really like about sketching on Procreate is also that you can rescale things and you can kind of rotate things very easily, so that makes it very nice and easy. I also really like to keep everything that I've been sketching just so I can refer back to it and experiment that way. As I am now narrowing it down, I can think that these two layouts are probably the most practical and the ones that I like the best. So these are not final designs, but I just like to redefine them a little bit and make sure that I have a clear layout before I move into Illustrator. Now that we've been sketching a little bit, I like to go into Adobe Illustrator and start testing out different typefaces. Now, of course, if you've done a very detailed sketch and you really love it and maybe you want that handcrafted feel, you could just image trace it, or you can recreate it with the pen tool, for example. But in my case, I usually create brands that are very digital first, I would say. And so in that case, I usually like to use the drawing stage as more of a way for me to look at opportunities with the layout and the letters, and then try to recreate it either fully or mostly partly, just as a way for me to see opportunities. So the first thing I do when I get into Illustrator is I start to try out different typefaces that either I know already from experience might be a good fit, or maybe ones that I'm just looking at and comparing them. You can also go to places like Envato Market or Creative Market, or you can go to places like Adobe Typekit, for example. One thing I always like to do is to also experiment with all caps versus all lowercase or mixed case examples. So sometimes a brand you think maybe will be all caps, but once you start trying it, it becomes way too serious. So experiment a little bit and see how that's going to work. I usually like to include different ways of the layout as well, so testing things like on an arch or at an angle and things like that. So sometimes that's going to work great and sometimes it really isn't. And it usually depends not only on the tone of the brand, but also on the specific letters that you have. So in this case, because we have a Y that's going to go below the line of the other letters, I feel like in a lowercase one, it looks a little bit awkward to try to create it on an arch. But also once we have the all caps version, we kind of get this really awkward spacing between all the bottoms of the letters. And so that's also something I don't really think is working in such a short name. Something that I often try to do in logos, which is something I think creates a lot of balance, is to try to look for ways to make something very symmetrical or just very pleasing to the eye that way. In this case, I can see that the I has a dot over it, and the Y, because it goes below the line, we can see that it can actually work as a dot underneath as well. This type of symmetry usually creates a sense of organization and calm, and that is something that we can also bring a bit of custom feeling and something that feels a little bit more playful as well. So this is going to be our final logo. I've rounded the bottom of the Y a little bit to create a more softer finish. We've got the mirroring dots, and we've got the connection between the F and the T, as well as just moving the letters around to make sure that the spacing between each letter feels really balanced. The next thing I like to do is to go to my mood board and just grab that and put it into my Illustrator document where I'm working on the branding. Because now that we have the mood board ready and we have the logo design, I want to start diving into colors and typography and overall design choices. The first thing I like to do is just establish the base colors that I think would be appropriate. And as we're seeing, these are going to change because basically as you play around, you might notice that the contrast between two colors is not going to work, or maybe there is something else that just makes it feel unappetizing with the food or the photography style. So the first thing I like to do here is I usually like to have at least one primary brand color. So in this case, that's going to be this very light purple color. A light color that I can use as kind of background color, just something to soften the stark white color, especially in a brand like this that has to do with very kind of like homegrown ingredient feelings. And then the third color I like to include is a darker color that can be used for things like footers or details that can bring out more contrast. So this one brand color that is a brighter color, in this case the purple, and then we have the lighter beige color and the darker kind of really dark teal green color. I started by creating this kind of coral color here, but as you can see, I'm noticing quickly that the yellow color is going to look a little bit more young and a little bit happier. So then I go into trying to see what color combinations work, because I don't think that it's always a good idea to let your clients or even you when you're designing things just combine any combinations of the colors that you're picking. So in this case, I think that on the dark colors like the yellow and the dark color that we have, the dark green, we're using a white logo, and on the other two colors we're using a black logo. I decided that I thought illustration would be something that adds a lot of value to this, not only because I'm an illustrator as well, but also because I think that you can bring a lot of texture to such a digital brand. So a lot of the vegan meats are based on things like soybeans, chickpeas, and peas, like regular garden peas or other types of peas. And that's something that I particularly love, the vegan food brands that are based on peas. So we're gonna focus on that today. So I created a cute little illustration here where we have some happy peas, and we have kind of the pea pods and the leaves and the little spirals that they do. And this is something that I've used a textured brush for, and I work in Procreate. So Procreate is just an illustration program that you use on your iPad, and I've then just exported them. And so if this was a brand that I would create for an actual client, I would, of course, after I've done all this rough work, I would go in and illustrate the exact versions and export them in the exact format. But in this case, I'm just experimenting, so I'm cutting and chopping pieces around just to see what the layout is going to look like. One thing that I want to make sure I am experimenting with is the color combinations to see how robust they are going to be. So I want to try to place it on things that are in practical use, like business cards and things that we might have as a web banner, or even things like what does it look like with the overlapping of text versus not overlapping. Because this type of detail is something that you can put in the brand guide to help your client understand better how to use the brand. At this stage, I'm also testing out different typography, so you'll see that I initially had this more serif font that was like an italic version, but I noticed that I needed to add more of a main text typeface as well, and it just got too messy. So what I ended up doing was to drop that serif one and just introduce the main text and use that for subtitles as well. So I think In very rare instances, maybe you can have more than two, but I think that demands so much skill as a designer to be able to find that many typefaces that work well together. So it's always a safe bet to either use different weights of the same typeface, or in this case, use two different typefaces that feel very different in weight anyway, in contrast or in size. So once we designed the logo, the colors, the type, the illustration, I'm gonna go and also design an icon for the logo. So something they can use for social media icons and things. My concept here was to work with the N and the Y being mirrored, and then using the two dots again from the concept as kind of peas in a pod, and I thought that was really cute. I play around with making sure that it's gonna look good in both inverted, so with black on white and white on black, because it always looks a little bit different. And the final stage, when you've created your brand and experimented lots and really feel comfortable about it, is to put it on different mock-ups. Now, I think this is one of those stages where even if you're feeling a little bit unsure about your design, once you're starting to put it on mock-ups, you can really see, is it holding water? And this is a perfect way to tweak and see, okay, this actually isn't high contrast enough, or this doesn't work in small formats, my type is not visible, something like that. So don't be afraid to make changes even when you're doing mock-ups. So let's have a look at the nifty finished brand. I'm so pumped about how it turned out, and I'm really happy that I decided to include illustration. I think that the packaging is adorable, but it also feels really playful, and you can really see the use for the different colors. We can see little things like stamps, and we can also see how this really easily translates to a very versatile brand like stickers and business cards and their website, for example. I really hope you found that helpful. I really love seeing the process of other people, and I really am kind of obsessed with how the packaging especially came out. I just love designing packaging. Let me know how you felt about the logos. Would you have picked another direction to go, or did you like the one that we ended up picking? Did you have a cool idea that I didn't think of? Let me know down in the comments. If you're curious about how to use illustration in more ways, especially for branding, I actually have a video specifically on that, so I'll make sure to link that here on the screen for you to go watch that next if you like. Thank you so much for watching. Super good luck with your projects, and see you next time.